If a will is invalid, unfortunately that means that an individual will be deemed to have passed away, what we call intestate, and that means that they do not have a testamentary disposition or a will. So by default they fall into what we call the intestacy rules, which is, you might describe it as a sort of a government pre-designed will, which will look at your personal scenario in terms of whether or not you're married, whether you have children or extended family, and your estate will be dealt with on the basis that if you have a spouse, they will receive a certain portion of your estate. If they have children, they will receive another portion. And unfortunately, the deceased individual may have completely different wishes to that government prescribed set out, but that is exactly what will happen.
I agree, and in fact, if I asked any of my clients to say whether they thought that the intestacy rules would match what they wanted to do, it would be a very small proportion who would agree that they are really rather odd provisions, and they can leave significant injustice and unfairness, and obviously then upset and distress in a family. The other thing that can happen if a will is invalid, of course, is that if the testator had made an earlier will, then that earlier will becomes valid again. So let's say that a gentleman had made a will in 2010, uncontroversial, but it was his will. Then he makes another one very, very different in 2015. In that will, he revokes his earlier will. So the earlier will is revoked. Then subsequently, when he dies, his will is challenged, and it's found to be invalid because, let's say, for example, of undue influence. Well, that then means that his earlier will, which might not be what he wanted to happen at all, even if the subsequent will was challenged correctly, he might still want to move away from that earlier will. That earlier will, nonetheless, is his last will, and it's come back to life, if you like, and that's how his estate will be distributed.
The other problem with the intestacy rules are that, unfortunately, they may not be particularly tax efficient, as well as not actually meeting your personal wishes. So individuals not receiving what you would otherwise like them to receive. It can very often be the case that as a result of that, tax efficiency is completely out of the window, and any work that you may have done to try and mitigate inheritance tax, perhaps leaving charitable legacies or things like that, it's just, unfortunately, they fall by the wayside, and people end up quite disgruntled, or the family and friends that are left behind end up quite disgruntled. The other sort of big issue as well with the intestacy rules is that common law partners do not at this time receive anything under the intestacy rules. So a couple could have been living together for 30 years with children, a house and a whole history behind them, but their partner will not be entitled to receive any part of the deceased individual's estate simply because they haven't signed a marriage or civil partnership agreement.
The outcome then is that that the partner in those circumstances, assuming they've been cohabiting for 2 years or more, which in these circumstances they will have done, will be forced to challenge the terms of the intestacy in the courts under the Inheritance Act 1975, which effectively means that that person will be suing his or her own children, which is, as you can imagine, it's emotionally and financially very damaging.